Russia as public space. A question that Christopher Neidhart asked in his Russia's Carnival, The Smells, Sights, and Sounds of Transition, a wonderful book to take a look at, is the question of, did a post-Soviet Russia smell different? Did it sound different? And he said yes. As you've seen from your readings, Pelevin particularly stressed the Soviet grayness, and that a scent of socialism was the smell of cabbage and diesel. There's an argument made in Russia's Carnival that free elections were low on the list of what most Russians cared about. It was not seen as a high priority for a democratic society, in part because they were tired. Revolutions, transitions, transformations, and the collapse of an empire is exhausting. And so Russians were tired of the chaos, the carnival of transition. They were tired of democracy because it's hard work. They want order and stability. Hence, Putin's presidency has been overall more popular than not. And also, overall, I think even you could say most societies, dissent is not mainstream. It's not desirable. That there's a sense of just sort of accepting the status quo and being willing to sort of go along with what's good for you, as determined by the authorities that be. So before we get into the question of space, I just want to make sure that we say goodbye to Yeltsin and hello to Putin, and we will be spending the rest of the semester looking at Putin's Russia. And Vladimir Putin, born in 1952, was an unknown former KGB figure from St. Petersburg, and he was picked to be prime minister by Yeltsin. And he is called upon by Yeltsin to take over and continue the transformation of Russia into a strong new state. In the end of the century, December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin, in his address, announces his immediate resignation and appoints Putin as his acting president. And he's been the president pretty much ever since, even when Medvedev has been the president. In the March 2000 presidential elections, Putin wins 53% of votes, and so begins the Putin years. And the Putin years, as you can see, it's very important for Putin, as was the most recent election of 2018, to try to get a big turnout, even though there's really no strong candidates to go against him. He wants to make sure that he gets a significant percentage of the overall votes. So, thinking about space, I find space in history very interesting, and think about the role of space, what kind of space, and how this space is used. What is private space? Where do we have it? How do we use it? What is public space? Where do we have it? How do we use it? What is symbolic space? Where do we have it? How do we use it? And space is important in terms of a democratic society. It's how citizens use public space. It is sort of a hallmark of a functioning democratic society. And so looking at civil society as defined, it is a sphere of activity that is initiated, organized, and carried out primarily by citizens and not directed by the state. It's voluntary, self-generating, autonomous. Common norms are shared and understood, and the right and ability to protest government action is key to the aspect of a civil society. Ergo, civil society is key to a democracy. Authoritarian states have weak civil societies and also very limited civil spaces. So think about civic society, civic spaces, and one of the hallmark of Russian Soviet society is the lack of civil society. Hence, civil spaces are lacking. State organizes society. This has been an enormous feature of Russian history. So the state controls spaces. State spaces connote state power. And there's no shortage of symbolic spaces, but the question is how will they be used and what narrative will be employed. There's, I think, a very interesting article by Graham Gill, Changing Symbols, the Renovation of Moscow Place Names, and he states that the closer into the center of the city, meaning Moscow, and to the Kremlin, the greater the changes. The farther away from the center, the fewer the changes. So the closer to the core of state power, then symbols will be more important and be more noticeable. But as one gets further out, particularly, say, in the countryside or more remote areas, that the state does not have as much control and has not as much space under its control. So there's sort of this, it's an interesting idea of core versus periphery for spaces and control of those spaces. And the state wants to create this symbolic culture to reinforce and legitimize its power. This is true not only for Russian politics, but for states in general. And so iconographic images are created and maintained and pushed forward to create a narrative that is understood, where these images, these symbols, are known for what they are saying about the state. One of these examples is just changing, making sure that flags are understood, that songs are understood, and this sort of cultural restoration under Putin, where in 2000 the Soviet-era anthem is revived with new lyrics. Russia, our holy country, the Soviet red flag is reinstituted as the official banner of the army. The tricolor Russian flag, the imperial double-headed eagle, is adopted. In 2005, a new Tsar-style ceremony of changing of the Kremlin guards is established, with the uniforms designed after the Russian military garb worn during the reign of Nicholas II. So this sort of iconographic symbols that are used are this sort of blend of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, and the citizens understand these symbols as a message of power of the Russian state. Well, home is a place, home is a space, and it's as if this, back to this idea of core versus periphery for assuming power, it's all about location and ownership of that location. So when the state names a space, it begins to see itself as owning that space, controlling that space. Public spaces are often controlled by the state. A good example of naming the space, hence creating its narrative, is St. Petersburg, named first to honor Peter the Great, then changed to Petrograd during World War I, then to Leningrad after World War I and the death of Lenin, back to St. Petersburg. So this is sort of this circular narrative of power. And so what you see in these years is sort of connection to the past, to the present, and also a disconnect of the present to the past, depending if it is a narrative that wants to be sort of rejected or minimized or hidden. So it sort of all boils down to this really interesting part of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of a strong Russia under Putin, of what happens when there's regime change and name change and identity change, and what is it? And the occupation of a public space is a political act, and I think we're very well aware of that in terms of protests in the United States when they're taken in a public square. We understand that narrative. The political stories are often very visible and understood by locals and tourists alike, such as Red Square, which is a historical political space in Moscow, that the power of the state, the power of the glorious past of Russia, is immediately understood. And to then take this narrative and place it to other areas, such as the Putin Street in Grozny, which I talked about last week also before I was cut out, where To own a space, you name that space and you take control of it and make it a space that is about your political power, such as the Putin Street in Grozny, where you rebuild and you rename. And this idea that by creating this newly renamed Putin Avenue, he is going to be seen as an important and positive component of this narrative. And so this raises the question of sort of public space and monuments, monumentalism, and the differences between state monumentalism and capitalist sort of casino monumentalism. And you might want to consider Palevin's take on this also. So there are monuments that also are part of this sort of political public space, and depending on what that monument is, it's going to tell a different story. The public, again, is tired by what is going on, and so how does the Russian public read the use of space? The 2007 Russian public opinion poll showed that 60% of Russians were not interested in politics, 24% were totally indifferent, 37% show interest. And one of the interesting factors in this poll is that age mattered, that the older the respondents were, the more they showed interest in politics, and that political views were informed by relatives and the president. But overwhelmingly, and this remains fairly true and not surprising, is this political apathy, that indifference is the bottom line. And so there's this retreat into the private spaces, or sort of back into the kitchen, which the Russians, as you know from your readings, had used as their personal space that they could trust in. So there is this sort of public persona versus the around the kitchen table persona for Russians. And by the end of the 1990s, there was a decline in civil society, the decline in the use of public space, and in part because there was a breakdown in law enforcement and a destabilization of public spaces, and that personal safety was not guaranteed in public, particularly by the police, as we'll see later on. So the focus on the private family space seems to be in part because of the lack of security in public spaces. There's a vast distrust of public sphere and formal organizations in Russian society, and this is rooted in its history. There's also unfavorable economic conditions. And I think one of the things to keep in mind also about the use of space is the role of terror. And to make a place seem a public space more unsafe is to create the possibility of terrorist act. And so consider Putin's war and terrorism and how this affects the use of public space, of civil space. And the Second Chechen War in 1999 and beyond made it more apparent that Russians were not safe in the public, or they weren't even safe at their homes. In 1999, there's a series of bombings, including the bombing of 3 Russian apartment buildings with 243 dead. And there seems like there was a role of the Russian state secret police in this. There's conspiracy theories galore. And it appeared that suicide bombings were sort of the new normal. Were these international or domestic terrorist acts? There was human rights violations and the killing of journalists at the core and at the periphery. And then in 2003, 11 suicide attacks killed at least 223 people across Russia. In August 2004, 2 airplanes were bombed, killing 90 passengers. A woman blows herself up outside a Moscow subway station, killing 9 and wounding over 50. And then there's this horrible atrocity in Beslan of September 1st, 2004, where in a middle school number 1, the school is held hostage with over 300 dead. And another very horrific terrorist act, again sort of connecting public space and terror, was the October 23rd, 2002 Moscow theater hostage tragedy. Now you can see that there's this very sort of tenuous, ambivalent relationship between the public and how it should use space, in part because of its history and of current situations.